This was a group effort.
This is Philip Bergen from the Mass Historical Commission. He's the preservation officer. He made sure that Leominster got Pine Grove Cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places.
It was a long process, wasn't it?
Oh, wasn't it, Philip? It was a long process, but now that you see it, what do you think?
I was back here about a year ago looking to spend a morning looking through the stones and looking through the natural features of the cemetery. It's a beautiful place. This is a lovely day for it to be recognized, and I'm glad it's finally on the National Register.
Thank you.
Yeah, it came out really nice. I like the way they trim the trees. You can see.
Okay, now just to give you a little bit of an idea of what this place is, I'm going to ask Chet to do a little bit of reading.
Well, I'm going to read, as you take your tour, and down there, about halfway down on that wall in the front on Main Street, is a plaque. And this tells pretty much the whole story. It says, and it's courtesy of the DPW, right, Pat? Yep. It says, Pine Grove Cemetery, established in 1742. Pine Grove Cemetery is the oldest of 4 cemeteries in the city of Leominster. It faces into the category of a town and city cemetery, established as a municipal burial ground next to Leominster's first meeting house, which at the time was the center of town. And there's a stone in the northwest corner of the cemetery that indicates where it was. Therefore, this cemetery occupied a fairly central important space within the community. Since it was closed to burial in 1937, Pine Grove Cemetery lost its primary function, that of a place of active burial. Pine Grove Cemetery is unique in that it has one of the heaviest concentrations of Revolutionary War veterans buried on its grounds. There are 94 known burials from the Revolutionary War, 4 from the Civil War, and 30 from the War of 1812. It sits next to this park, Carter Park, a military training ground for soldiers starting with the Indian Wars and including those up to 1812.
I guess it's this time now, folks, that we dedicate the cemetery. Okay? So, you ready? The City of Leominster Historical Commission, the Mass Historical Commission, and the United States Department of Interior dedicates Pine Grove Cemetery as Leominster's hallowed ground to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places.
The official designation reads Pine Grove Cemetery, Leominster, Massachusetts. It was accepted on March 12, 2008 for the inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the nation's official list of buildings, districts, sites, structures, and objects that retain their historical character and are important to our local, state, or national history. The National Register was established under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and is administered in the Commonwealth by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. Signed, William Francis Galvin, Secretary of the Commonwealth, Chairman, Mass Historical Commission, and Brona Simon, State Historic Preservation Officer. Mass Historical Commission, a division of the Secretary of the Commonwealth. We did it. That's our second designation. The other one is downtown.
I'd like to turn the dedication ceremony over to our historian now, and I'm going to ask Mark to come forward and do his presentation.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Mark.
I too want to thank all of the city officials, especially the mayor, for cooperating in creating a really wonderful space now. I've been in Pine Grove Cemetery researching since 2002, and I can tell you it's never looked like this. I also want to thank Guy Glodis, who sent down work crews to help and assist with this work. And this place is really, really a greatly improved asset to the city of Leominster at this point. What I'd like to do is direct the whole group to the entrance so that we can get into the cemetery, which is a set of stone stairs at the northwest. I'll speak as loud as I can. Welcome to historic Pine Grove Cemetery. I've often said or thought that the sun filters through this place like no other place. This cemetery is not important because it's old. It's important because it provides a connection for us to the past, a connection through understanding the struggles and crises that the people here, that are interred here, faced, just like we face every day of our life. It's also important because you'll find that many of these people also faced struggles that had a direct connection to what was happening in our nation at the time that they were battling along. What my intention to do today is to give you folks an idea of who these people were, so that it's not just a bunch of slate and a nice lawn and some trees, but there are real stories here of real importance. And once we understand those, we can have better reverence for this place. We can have better reverence for human life in general and our connection in the historical scheme of things from generation to generation. I'll start with the tale of the two Ebenezers. Don Pimarini mentioned Ebenezer Houghton. There was also an Ebenezer Wilder. And apparently these two fellows' land abutted. And as Don indicated, Ebenezer Houghton's land went up the hill, and Ebenezer Wilder's land was on this side of the cemetery. Well, at some point, they needed a place to build a meeting house. The town had been incorporated in 1740. This is actually not the first place people were buried in Leominster. In 1740 itself, a traveler had died on Jonathan Wilson's farm up in North Leominster, and they needed a place to bury him. So they buried him on the corner of Day Street and Main Street, and that became an unofficial cemetery for a number of years. Over time, the stones were broken, the cemetery was not cared for, and the farmer that owned the land just simply removed the rest of the headstones and returned the land to farming, something of course we would never want to happen here. But getting back to the tale of the Ebenezers, apparently Ebenezer Houghton wanted to sell the land to the town for the meeting house, but Ebenezer Wilder was willing to give the land to the town for the meeting house. Now just take a guess whose land they got. So some things don't change. So they bought Ebenezer Houghton's land, and Ebenezer Wilder ended up giving them a piece of land, not for the meeting house, but what became a part of the cemetery. Now that piece of historical information is related to us by David Wilder, who of course was an ancestor of Ebenezer Wilder, so maybe we have to take that tongue-in-cheek, I don't know. There are a number of graves in the cemetery that don't have headstones, but have proven bodies. And this particular plaque, which was erected by the WPA, recognizes that fact. These fellows here who served in the Revolutionary War don't have headstones in this cemetery. A couple of them are noteworthy. One of them is Oliver Carter, who is the fellow who donated the land for the training field, which is just south of here where we were standing just earlier this afternoon. The other fellow is a gentleman named Asa Johnson. Asa Johnson was Leominster's first lawyer, and he was also an eccentric fellow. He served in a number of capacities. He marched on Lexington and Concord on that fateful day on April 19th, 1775. He also became a privateer. And if anybody knows what that is, that's somebody who actually gets into a ship and goes floating out into the ocean and tries to take enemy shipping away and capture enemy shipping. And when they captured the enemy shipping, the folks on board the boat got to divide up the prize. Well, he was captured in this process and brought to a prison by the British in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He escaped prison, got back onto a privateer, actually captured a British vessel, divided the prize money with the rest of his mates, took his share of the prize money, went to Harvard College, and got his legal education. Then he came back here to practice in Leominster, but that's only part of the story of Asa Johnson. Asa Johnson was an eccentric. He did such things as eat things that other people wouldn't eat. For instance, snakes, owls, bats, rats, things like that, always on a wooden trencher as opposed to a porcelain plate. Our 17th century brethren believed on eating on wooden plates because they were afraid of metals leaching out from pewter or other materials. Apparently Mr. Johnson kept that practice up because he would never eat on a porcelain plate. He also had a daughter, but he was never married. He was an atheist, but he went to meeting regularly. He had a great singing voice, and he had this idea in the late 18th century that he would introduce musical instruments to the meeting house to enhance the music. Well, most of the congregation enjoyed that a great deal, but a few people didn't. One of the elder deacons, Israel Nichols, who you'll hear about a little later this morning, drove him crazy. Couldn't take the noise. So a couple of services on Sundays, he would just grab his hat and he'd leave in disgust the meeting house based on the antics of the atheist Asa Johnson. Asa Johnson ended up living till 1820. He had a shop that is roughly where the old Boston Fish Market is today. Never made a great deal of money, but he was apparently a pretty bright guy. He was a Democratic Republican in an area that was mostly Federalist. Ran for office several times, state representative, almost made it, never quite made it. Served in a number of local capacities from school committee and postmaster, justice of the peace and such. Okay, at this point we're going to move down the road here and point out a few more additional graves. While we're on the theme of lawyers, we come upon Mr. William Perry, who died in 1844. Mr. Perry was the only practicing lawyer at the time of his death in Leominster. And that couldn't have been too good because they say when there's one lawyer in town, he's not doing too well. When there are two, they're doing very well. I do have a photograph or a photograph of a painting of Mr. Perry, and I can sort of pass that through the crowd. Somebody could just get that back to me later on, but that's what Mr. Perry looked like. Mr. Perry apprenticed to a lawyer named Abijah Bigelow. Abijah Bigelow was Leominster's second lawyer. He graduated from Dartmouth in 1795. He was our first representative in the United States Congress, and he served in Congress during the War of 1812. Well, when Mr. Bigelow was away at Congress, his associate or his clerk, Mr. Perry, was minding the store. And Mr. Bigelow was married to Hannah Gardner, the daughter of Reverend Francis Gardner. And of course, they corresponded like loving husband and wife. And I have a letter that I retrieved off the internet that dated Leominster, November 5th, 1812. And it's a letter from Mrs. Bigelow to Mr. Bigelow while he's in Washington serving his country, discussing a little bit of, one of the discussions is Mr. Perry. And she says in the letter, Mr. Perry will continue in his steady habits as usual, appears to have private business whenever I go into the office. He immediately puts by his writing and takes up a book into his hands as though he was engaged in studies. So apparently Mrs. Bigelow was not too impressed with the exploits of Mr. Perry while Mr. Bigelow was away. I can tell you that Mr. Bigelow wrote back, look, it's the only guy you got, so do the best you can. So in any event, Mr. Perry, when he passed away, left Leominster loyalists, at least for a short period of time. And now we're going to move a little further down on this side. This stone doesn't very well depict this woman's beginnings. As you can tell, it hasn't weathered the age all that well. It's a solitary stone. This woman was a Cushing from Pembroke. She came from a very wealthy family. And she married another influential New England family, or married into another influential New England family called the Estabrooks. And the Estabrooks were from Lexington. And if anybody's ever been down to Lexington, you might know that there's an Estabrook school, and there are a number of other things named after the Estabrooks. Well, she was the husband of Nathaniel Estabrook. Nathaniel Estabrook's father was Joseph Estabrook, educated at Harvard College, and who became a Congregationalist minister and went off and had a parish in Athol. But what's most notable about Joseph Estabrook, her father-in-law, is that he was the youngest respondent to the battle green Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. And the other notable thing about Mr. Joseph Estabrook is that he was accompanied by his father's slave, who was the only black to respond to the battle green on that fateful day. These folks bought the Kendall Tavern. They were the second owners of the Kendall Tavern. And Mr. Estabrook ran the tavern for a short time, and then the tavern business didn't turn out too well. In the middle part of the, early to middle part of the 19th century, the tavern business became a little bit difficult as a result of a movement which we're going to talk about in just a few moments. In any event, they were well-to-do people, as I suggested. They ran it as a gentleman's farm for many, many years. Mr. Estabrook died in 1876, so he survived his wife by a good period of time. And it's while the Estabrooks owned the farm that the myth or legend develops that the Kendall Tavern was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, there's no proof of that. There was a physical tunnel at one point from the main house to one of the barns. There's an uninscribed piece of paper written by somebody about 100 years ago that said that that was a place for itinerant black labor to escape from the house into the barn, out the back of the barn, into the North Monusnock Hills. Now that kind of makes a little bit of sense because there was a movement of blacks, free blacks from Boston out to the western part of the state, making their way to Canada, Montreal, to be free once and for all. And there was a fear that slave catchers were coming into Boston, and these people would be on foot traveling, probably without a lot of money. If they came upon a friendly place like the Estabrook Farm and needed some money, they would probably stay there for a short period of time and work to get some money. Mr. Estabrook needed the labor. As you can see, his wife died early on, and he could have used the help, I'm sure. So there is probably some credence to that legend, although it remains one that's unproved. If we'll now move to the blessed stone over here. The final resting place of Leominster's fourth minister, Abel Conant. He served until 1836. He presided over the construction of the third meeting house. We talked a little bit earlier about the first meeting house. Well, the second meeting house was built in the Common, and that served as Leominster's meeting house until 1823, I believe. Thank you, Jane. And in 1823, the city of Leominster bought land of the widow Maria Chase. We'll get to her later on. And that land is where the Unitarian Church is now today. And Leominster's third meeting house was built on that site. And Mr. Conant supervised the construction of that. He also supervised the separation of church and state because in 1835, there was a formal separation in Massachusetts of church and state. We think in today's terms of there always being a separation of church and state. Well, that wasn't the case. The church and the state were the same from the Revolution all the way up until 1835. The second meeting house was disassembled and rebuilt where City Hall is currently today, and this became only a godly place by 1835. There was a donation of a clock and a bell by notable citizens of Leominster. Joel Crosby, one of Washington's bodyguards during the Revolutionary War, donated the clock for this building, and Jonas Henry Kendall donated the bell for this building. Abel Conant was a great temperance man, and as I just mentioned to you at the other grave, by 1820s, 1830s, temperance was developing into a movement. in Massachusetts. Up to this point in time, a lot of the religious belief in the 17th century and in the early 18th century was what the Pilgrims thought, which was that everybody was elect, that you were born with grace, that nothing you did during your lifetime could achieve grace if you weren't born that way. In other words, you were elect. By the 19th century, that notion starts to change, and it develops into a notion of good acts, that you could get salvation by doing godly things. And that's where a lot of these movements start: temperance, women's rights, anti-slavery, abolition. All of these movements start with this thought process of the early 19th century. Now, temperance being one of them, Mr. Conant, or Reverend Conant, was a great temperance man. I want to read to you a portion of one of his sermons. If there are any who are making too free use of spirits, or find themselves thus inclined, I would entreat you to pause and reflect. Think seriously, candidly, and impartially upon what may be the consequences almost before you are aware. Reformation may be difficult. It may call for much self-denial, but it is beyond the ability of no man, if he will but exert the power God hath given him. The work here is to be effected as in other cases. It is to be done by reflection, resolution, and action. No one, however, need magnify this work. He need not look forward and picture in his imagination how much he must deny himself, how much he must suffer, should he never taste spirit again. No, there is no call for anything of that kind, and it may discourage him in regard to the work before he begins. All the man who would break a habit of indulgence has to do is say to himself, when the time arrives at which he has been accustomed to take the Spirit, I shall take none now. I shall not, and I will not, when the next time comes, let him say, no, I shall take none now. I shall not, I will not. Thus he who resolves always to take on the present, through he thinking nothing of the future, will be secure by seeing no part of the work but what is before him. Sound familiar? One day at a time, maybe? All right, we'll move from this grave now right behind us. We're going to move right back up up the road the other side. This way, right back up the same road. Silas Richardson was the sexton in this cemetery for many years. And what a sexton did was essentially all of the undertaking services for the community. Back in those days, before the 20th century, the funeral services were carried on by the town, not private entities. Not until the late 19th century or early 20th century did private funeral homes start to spring up. In back of this grave, just over to this side, Captain David Allen. If any of you are interested, you can take a look at what Mr. Allen looked like. David Allen was a carpenter, and he used his carpentry skills to build caskets. And his shop was located approximately where Kentucky Fried Chicken is today. And he built a lot of the caskets that are under the ground we're standing on right now. We're going to work back up this road. In his presentation earlier, Don mentioned the Wilder family, which of course is a prominent name, one of Leominster's founding families. Right behind you are the graves of William Wilder and his wife, Mary Wilder. Mary was a Hills, by the way, engaged in the comb industry. And to the left of their graves is a young daughter, Adeline. What comes out of this, interestingly, is a woman. One of William Wilder and Mary Wilder's children was Frances, or Dolly, her given name. Later become Frances Drake when she married Jonathan Drake. She is probably one of the most significant historical figures in Leominster. She's not buried in Evergreen, but she's buried, I mean, she's not buried in Pine Grove, but she's buried in Evergreen. She lost her mother, her brother, and her young sister, 13-year-old sister, all within the span of a couple of years. And that might give you an idea as to why her life was shaped the way it was shaped. But she was an ardent abolitionist. Not only did she believe in freeing slaves, but she believed in racial equality, which was something that wasn't thought about by a lot of abolitionists of the day. She had a confirmed, her house was a confirmed stop on the Underground Railroad. It was commemorated a couple of years ago. It is on the National Historic Register as well. And there was a rescue of a slave there named Shadrach Minkins, who was probably one of the most important things that's ever happened on Leominster soil, because Shadrach Minkins was one of the first test cases under the Compromise of 1850, where the federal government gave extra teeth to the slave catchers by taking away former slaves' rights to a jury trial in Massachusetts and bringing them before of a federal commissioner who would get $10 to send them back to slavery and $5 to free them. So the very first person captured under that law, Shadrach Minkins, was brought to Mrs. Drake's home, and this is Mrs. Drake's parents right here, and her young sister. These are graves of the Robbins family. Mr. David Robbins was one of the first settlers of Leominster. His house still stands at the corner of Hammond and North Main Street. It was built in 1743. This is his grandson, Thomas Robbins. His son, also named Thomas Robbins, I have a photograph of him, started the Robbins Trotting Park, which we know now as Doyle Field. And the Robbins family was very influential in the creation and the start of Leominster. And as I said, David Robbins, one of the early settlers, his house still stands. Now we're standing in an empty spot with no headstones, but there are two people buried here. Sarah and Abel Kendall are buried here. Unfortunately, Sarah Kendall took her life in 1819, and she's buried right in this piece of ground right here. Her husband, Abel Kendall, had a brother named Jonas Kendall, and Jonas Kendall is the fellow that built the Kendall Tavern. They had a dispute in the early 1820s when the church was separating. If any of you know a little bit about the religious history at that point, what was occurring is that the Unitarian Church was moving away from certain Christian doctrines, like the deity of Christ and original sin. And some of the Congregationalists weren't buying that. And they were called Orthodox Congregationalists or Evangelical Congregationalists. And they went on to create their own church. But back in the day, you just didn't leave a church. You asked for permission to leave a church. And Abel Kendall asked for permission with a number of other Leominster citizens to leave the church. This was only a short 4 years after his wife had taken her own life. And he asked for permission to the church council. And the church elder was his brother, Jonas. And the first petition to ask for removal from the church was written and signed all in one hand. And that document, those records are preserved today in the Unitarian Church. And the Reverend there was good enough to let me look at those one day. And Mr. Kendall, Jonas Kendall, remarked, "I can't pass on this petition. It's not signed by the people who it represents that signed it. It's all signed by the same person." So the petitioners went back and they created a new petition, and they all signed it individually and presented their petition. And after a time, the church council deliberated, and they issued this decision. "Feeling for you, we would commend you to the great head of the church, praying that he would cause his spirit to descend upon you and correct those errors which in our opinion you have fallen into, that he would lead you to repentance and enable and dispose you to walk worthy of the high vocation wherewith you are called, with all meekness and lowliness and long-suffering, endeavoring to keep the unity of spirit and the bonds of peace, Jonas Kendall, per order, Leominster, October 25th, 1822. So I guess the answer was no. You're on your own. And that's exactly what happened. All those folks went off, created the Congregational or Orthodox Congregational Church, which was located where the Pilgrim Congregational Church is today. And of course, the Pilgrim Congregational Church replaced that building. So the two brothers apparently had a split. It was at about this time that Jonas Kendall himself was serving a term in Congress. Jonas Kendall is not buried in in Pine Grove. He's buried in Evergreen, but his father's grave is in this cemetery. Right behind me, there was a mention earlier about a number of veterans in this place. This is a veteran of the War of 1812. This is William Snow. And what happened during the War of 1812, as you remember, there was a number of maritime engagements, and there was a very real fear that the British were going to invade certain parts of America. In fact, they did. As you might recall from your history, the British did invade Washington. They burned the Capitol. They burned a number of other public buildings in the Capitol. As a matter of fact, Abijah Bigelow, when he was in Congress, had to sit in the Patent Building and convene Congress in the Patent Building because it was one of the few public buildings left after the British had done their damage. Well, the British didn't just invade Washington. They also invaded Maine and occupied Maine for a number of months. So there was a very real fear among the citizens, even here in Leominster, that the British would invade. So they raised a group of artillery, and under Colonel Tenney from Leominster, they marched for about 40 days, as I recall, to the battery in South Boston to shore up the forces there and protect us from a British invasion, which fortunately never occurred. But this young fellow, Mr. Snow, was among that company. And unfortunately, he caught sick while he was in Boston, developed a fever, and died. And his remains were brought back, and he's interred right here in Leominster. This is the grave of Reverend Francis Gardner. And Reverend Gardner, having the great respect of his community, was honored with this stone, which of course faces up towards heaven because of his distinction as a reverend. He came into the church at a time when there was great discord in Leominster. The church in Leominster actually split in two in 1762. And after that split, he took one of the precincts and led that precinct. It was said that he did it in a very dignified way, that it could have become a very divisive, or an even more divisive situation, but that he led the greater body of the citizens of Leominster with distinction and dignity, and he was very well respected. He was his secretary, which he used in his office where he wrote his sermons, is in the collection at the Leominster Public Library and still can be viewed today. And that secretary actually comprised Leominster's very first library, because learned fellows in the town that wanted access to books would go to Reverend Gardner's study and be able to read books there to increase their knowledge. This is one of our Revolutionary War veterans, Michael Newell. He served both in terms of, well, he served an enlistment at Cambridge right after the Battle of Lexington and Concord for several months. This is the final resting place of Dr. Thomas Gowing, one of Leominster's first doctors. He came here from Linfield. He married a Richardson. He married Major James Richardson's daughter. If you go back in the other section where we came from, you'll notice there's a very good-sized large stone there, and those are the children of the Gowings. The Gowing's daughter married a Nichols, and you'll notice one of the names is Thomas Gowing Nichols. Well, Dr. Gowing also married off one of his nieces to Jonas Kendall, the fellow that built the Kendall Tavern. He was a well-respected doctor. The Leominster Historical Society has his prized hourglass in its collection. That can be seen actually right now in the Leominster Public Library in its display case. He was a very well-respected fellow. He served on the Committee of Correspondence that was set up by the Sons of Liberty to disseminate information about revolutionary activities during the mid-1770s, 1773, 1774. If you look right back behind him, Israel Nichols, which is the stone, next stone over here, was also a member of that Committee of Correspondence, along with Dr. Gowing. Thomas Leggett was also a member. You may have heard that name before. These fellows were instrumental in developing a revolutionary connection to the folks at the Sons of Liberty and the folks in Boston. Israel Nichols is also that same deacon that Asa Johnson drove out of the church, by the way. His son, which is buried right next to him, William Nichols, answered the call to Lexington and Concord. He also was a partner with one of the Kendalls in the paper mill business, and was a businessman for many years in the city of Leominster, or town of Leominster at that point. Okay, this is the final resting place of Jonas Kendall I, or he died in 1799. His house still stands on West Street. His house is currently owned, I believe, by the, name escaped me, who knows?
Jeremy?
No, that's his son, Jonas Kendall Jr. Further down, that's it. The Andersons own what was Jonas Kendall's house. A more simple house, much more simple house than his son built. He came to Leominster. His father, Samuel Kendall of Woburn, deeded him the land. He was a very well-respected citizen and one of Leominster's early founders. He was also a proprietor of land in Townsend, in Athol. His son, he deeded 100 acres of land to his son where the Kendall Tavern is built, and that's the house that the Bells so finely keep today. His son had the benefit of an economic downturn. In 1785, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation, and the country was in a mess, and there weren't any jobs, and there wasn't any money. And Jonas Kendall Jr. took advantage of the situation and got a bunch of unemployed shipwrights from Boston to come up and build that beautiful federal building that you see today. But his father wasn't as fortunate when he built his house in 1751. One of his daughters, Prudence Kendall, married a Jonas Johnson, who was a trader, along with his brother Jotham Johnson, who is buried right there. Jotham Johnson was the first guy to establish a stage between Boston and Leominster. And Jonas Johnson had a distinction of not showing up to militia practice very often. And they used to fine you for that. And as I did my research, I found that he paid more fines than any other fellow for not showing up to militia. Now, interestingly enough, I wrote a play about the Kendalls a number of years ago, and I cast Jonas Johnson as one of our local businessmen. And that particular guy didn't show up for play practice much either. So apparently I must have cast him right. Now come to the connection to the Reverend John Rogers of England, who was the first martyr under the reign of Mary, Bloody Queen of Scots. Now, problem is modern genealogists don't believe that's true. So, but Reverend Rogers did. So, in any event, whether there's a connection or not, we'll never know. But it's interesting to think that way. Problem is that Reverend Rogers was ahead of his time. He started to question things. He started to question he questioned the deity of Jesus Christ. He questioned the doctrine of original sin. And you may remember from the discussion I had about let's say 70 years ago, when we were at the fourth minister's grave, those things actually came to fruition in the Unitarian Church eventually. but not in the 1760s. The 1760s, the Congregationalists weren't ready to abandon Jesus Christ or the doctrine of original sin. Now, some members of the community said, he hasn't done anything wrong. He has committed no immorality. All he's doing is looking to find more light, and that's what he's supposed to do in the Bible. So there were a number of our local citizens that stuck by his side, but not all of them. And the rest of the citizens got together and formed a church council. Church council consisted of reverends from churches all over this part of New England. They got together, they warned him first. They said, stop this. Well, he didn't, as you probably guessed. So the second time, he got dismissed. What did he do? Did something American. He filed suit in the Worcester Superior Court. And the court ended up issuing a judgment that said, okay, John Rogers, we're going to give you your precinct, and that's going to be in North Leominster. And the rest of you God-fearing, Jesus-believing folks will continue in your ways with your new minister in the main precinct, which stayed in the meeting house. Actually, at that time, the meeting house right behind you, because the second meeting house wasn't built yet. And this is 1762. And then they said to the townspeople that if that meeting house, a new meeting house in North Leominster with Mr. Rogers or Reverend Rogers, exists for 1 year, you'll pay him so many pounds. And if it exists for 10 years, you'll pay him again so many more pounds. So in other words, if he's successful, you'll have to give him some of the town money with which to subsist with. And his first meeting house was actually in his house itself, which still stands. It's at the bend in the road right across from where Paul's Pizza is today. There's an old green building there. That was Reverend Rogers' home. And it stood that way from 1762 to 1788. Almost all of the time that we were debating our allegiance and separation from the mother country, all the time that we were suffering through the Revolutionary War, the time that we were talking about a new form of government, the U.S. Constitution, all of those years neatly, from 1762, where the Intolerable Acts start, to 1788, where we have our first presidential election under the Constitution, we had two churches. And not until 1788 did they come back together as one church, which is something a lot of Leominster citizens don't know, but it's, you know, Leominster was sort of a unique place right from day one. We had our problems. The second reverend, of course, was Reverend Gardner, who preached here at the first meeting house until 1774, when it was moved to the Common. Now this stone I have some very personal experiences with. As I told you folks earlier, I wrote a play called An Evening at the Kendall Tavern, which talks about the election, the national election of 1800 that pitted John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And if you think presidential politics are vile today, it's got nothing on what happened back in 1800. It was outright vicious. And what that play did was it brought a bunch of local community members together, leaders of the community, to see what they would think about the election that was occurring in 1800. And before I wrote the research was a continuing endeavor. And one of the people that I cast in the play was a gentleman named Major Metaphor Chase. And Metaphor Chase is buried right here. Now, Major Metaphor Chase's widow was Maria Chase. And if you remember from earlier in the discussion, that's where the Unitarian Church is today. Where that third meeting house was built was the shop of Metaphor Chase. Of course, he died in 1806. The land was sold by his widow in the early 1820s to the town for the third meeting house. He died from inflamed bowels. Apparently he was a little uptight. But he was a distinguished fellow. He was well thought of and well respected in the community. He had a bit of a sketchy past. In his obituary he says, despite all of the indiscretion of his youth, he became one of the most respected citizens in Leominster. So there's always hope. Now, two personal experiences with this stone for me. First of all, after we performed the play the first time, Susan Shelton from the Leominster Public Library said, "You'll never believe this." And I said, "What?" She goes, "I want you to see his likeness." And I said, "You have his likeness?" She says, "Yes, we have a portrait of him." Now, the fellow that I cast in this role has red hair, and a dear friend of mine, we've been friends since we were in the 3rd grade, Peter Angelini, and I cast him in this role not having seen this painting. And if you ever see this painting, you'll conclude immediately that Metaphor Chase and Peter Angelini are almost dead ringers. The other experience I had with this stone was I wanted to bring the cast here to see the people that they were playing, to get an idea, to develop some reverence for these characters. And I didn't have that map that the Cemetery Commission maintains at the time. I was just wandering around here looking at these stones in awe. And one September day, you know, at this time of the year when it's beautiful like this, I was debating whether I would come into the cemetery and try to find this stone out of the 800 that are in here. And I said, I could be in there for hours looking for this stone. And I said, but it's such a beautiful day, maybe I should do it. Nah, go back and do some work. And finally, the beautiful day won out. I hopped this gate down here at Tremaine Street. I came up this road. I looked at this stone, and I said, I never really liked those stones. They kind of give me the heebie-jeebies. I don't know what it is about stones, tablet stones, but they kind of look different to me. But then I had this impulse, and I came running up, and I stuck my hand on it, and I looked down, and I said, oh my God, Metaphor Chase, bingo, first stone I looked at. So I think he was calling. Here is the grave of Colonel Timothy Boutell, who was a notable soldier during the Revolutionary period. He was encamped at Cambridge. But more importantly, what he did was he led a guard, an advance guard, in Petersham in 1786 against Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion at that point was, for those of you who don't know, you may recall when I was talking about how bad things were in 1785 and Jonas Kendall could build that big house because economic times were bad. Well, economic times got so bad that there was open rebellion developing in Massachusetts. People's homes were being foreclosed on. There was no credit. There was no money. Sound familiar? There were a bunch of people in Boston. The farmers in Western Massachusetts, they didn't like those people. And they actually took up arms. They said, enough. You're not foreclosing on our homes anymore. We're not going to let you dandies in the legislature run things anymore. We're going to rebel. So they took up arms. The whole country was in a mess. That rebellion is why the United States of America exists today. Because before that rebellion, George Washington, scholars think, would have had nothing to do with the Constitutional Convention. Remember that there was a constituted form of government in place called the Articles of Confederation. The U.S. Constitutional Convention was extrajudicial, meaning there was no right to do it. They just did it. So in a way, it was a bloodless revolution. But in order to do it, you needed somebody with credibility, somebody that the people would look to and respect. That person was George Washington. George Washington wasn't going to do that until when? Until Shays' Rebellion. He was so worried about what was happening in the country that he said, okay, I got to get involved in this Constitutional Convention. But for that, you could argue, we don't get the U.S. Constitution, this country might not exist in its form, the form we have today. It could have been 2 or 3 nations, could have been part of Canada, could have been anything. But the significance of this particular fellow is, when that rebellion was being waged, there were 2 camps. There was a big camp in Petersham of soldiers who were coming eastward, and there was another camp of soldiers at the Arsenal in Springfield. And this fellow, in a very cold January night, led an advance guard against the camp at Petersham and captured them without a shot. And so he's responsible for that, the fellow from Leominster. Right up on the hill are the Wilders, two David Wilders, Deacon David Wilder, both deacons. One of them was the older David Wilder was the first deacon of, the second deacon of the meeting house. The younger Deacon David Wilder was the fellow who wrote the history of Leominster in 1853 that I mentioned a little earlier. Remember me talking earlier in the discussion about the second lawyer to practice in Leominster being Abijah Bigelow. Abijah Bigelow, after serving a couple of terms in Congress, went off to Worcester and became the clerk of courts, where he presided for many years, and then practiced as a master of chancery. He was instrumental in furthering the aims of the American Antiquarian Society. His papers are lodged there. And he and the entire family is buried in the Rural Cemetery in Worcester, except for his young son and namesake, who's buried here. So I always thought that was a little sad, that his young boy and namesake is not with the rest of the family, but is interred here with us in Leominster. All right, this is Peter Joslin. He lived to a ripe old age, and actually his life started before Leominster was separated and incorporated naturally, and he had a farm in Lancaster. And one of the significances of Peter Joslin is he was married 3 times, but his first wife died at the hands of Indians. And what had happened was that his young son told him he had heard what he thought were Indians out in the hemp. And he warned his dad and said, I don't want to stay home today. So he begged his father to be able to go out in the farming fields with him, and his father complied. What ended up happening was the Indians attacked on baking day, and his wife fought the Indians bravely with a baking shovel, but the wife was tomahawked and killed. One of his daughters was killed. Another daughter was taken into captivity. A widow that was staying in the house was killed. The daughter that was taken into captivity was killed by the Indians, and his sister-in-law, who was also taken into captivity, was the only one that survived to come back and tell the story. So it's kind of very interesting to know that this grave, and it's sort of solitary in a way, is a man interred here that had those very real experiences in his lifetime. 1777, the town didn't fund its schools. Had to fund the war instead. And back then they were funding about 140, 150 pounds a year for the schools. They raised 500 pounds to fund the war that year, so the schools were closed. This town did a lot to meet its quota in the Revolutionary War, both in terms of soldiers as well as money. And the action in 1777, if you remember, was General Burgoyne. He was marching south from Canada, trying to split New England off from the rest of the colonies and essentially isolate New England, and then from the rest of the colonies, and win the war. Well, this Captain John Joslin led the troop from Leominster here out to Bennington to defend that area as part of that initiative, or as part of that action by General Burgoyne. And his young brother accompanied him on that mission, and his name was Thomas. Thomas never came back. He was shot through the heart, and his last words were, "I am a dead man. The Lord have mercy on my soul." But this stone kind of called out to me, and I said, this is too bad. I mean, whoever's interred here doesn't have a proper stone anymore. So I took the information that I could get off the stone to see if I could identify who this person was. And I was able to identify the person through the vital statistics, because they were aged 49 when they died. They died in 1771. There's an O in their name, and I was able to put it back to put it together that this is Nathan Johnson. And Nathan Johnson died, believe it or not, on October 4th, 238 years ago. So I said, geez, that's kind of fitting that we'd be doing this tour on the day that he died. To the founders, Gershom Houghton and his wife Elizabeth Rugg, 2 first white settlers in Leominster. They built their home up off of Hill Street in 1725. Elizabeth outlived Gershom, and she remarried Daniel Knight, and you can see that both of her husbands are buried side by side here. She doesn't have a headstone per se, and nobody's quite sure if she's actually buried here, which is kind of unique if you think about it. But these are Leominster's really original founders. And that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for coming, and I hope sometime you'll do your own self-guided tour someday. It's an absolutely spectacular place to enjoy for so many reasons, and it is really an important piece of Leominster's history.